You can't tow a fire captain's vehicle mid-rescue, right? I asked out loud as I sprinted down the HOA sidewalk, sweat trickling down my face, my boots slapping the pavement. Wrong. Apparently, you can, if you're Karen, and your precious HOA bylaws matter more to you than a trapped 8-year-old boy gasping for air under collapsed beams. My heart punched against my ribs as I turned the corner and watched in disbelief as the tow truck dragged away my marked fire SUV, my breaching tools still locked inside. And standing proudly next to it all, arms crossed like a victorious vulture, was Karen. I wasn't just a firefighter. I was the commanding officer on duty. And she had just sabotaged an active rescue. She had no idea who I was. But she was about to find out. The day had started like any other double shift. I just wrapped up 36 hours straight of back-to-back emergency calls, fires, and vehicle extractions, and I was more coffee than man at that point. The only thing keeping me upright was the thought of a hot shower and 2 hours of sleep before I returned for a scheduled department-wide drill. But fate had other plans. Just as I pulled into my driveway, my personal radio buzzed. It wasn't from dispatch. It was from Blake, one of my junior officers, who lived nearby. I heard urgency in his voice before the static cleared. A garage had collapsed 3 blocks away, and a child was trapped under debris. The ladder truck was rerouting from a downed power line. Blake had eyes on the scene but needed backup, fast. I didn't think twice. My SUV had one of the few breaching rams small enough to work in tight corners like collapsing garages. I flipped a U-turn so fast my tires screeched against the curb. The alley closest to the site was blocked off with construction barriers, and the only clear entry was through the HOA clubhouse lot, which happened to be mostly empty. I threw on my magnetic fire captain placard and emergency lights and parked right next to the rear gate. Not in anyone's personal space, not even over a line. I dashed to the back to grab the breaching tool when I realized I'd left the electronic lockbox key inside the SUV. Cursing under my breath, I jogged around the front and ran inside the clubhouse. The manager knew me and had agreed to let us temporarily store our HOA access codes there months ago. I was inside for maybe 3 minutes. 3. That's how long it took for everything to go to hell. When I came back out, I spotted her immediately. Blonde bob, white pantsuit, clipboard like a ceremonial sword of entitlement. Karen. She was circling my SUV like a hawk with a broken moral compass. I called out to her, winded but polite. "That's an emergency vehicle, ma'am." She turned slowly, eyes narrowing as if I'd just told her I was here to paint her mailbox neon green. "This isn't a fire lane," she said, smug as ever. "And your vehicle doesn't have department tags. That's illegal parking. I've already called the tow." I raised my hands in disbelief. "It's clearly marked Fire Captain, Active Duty. There's a child trapped 2 blocks over and I have rescue equipment in the back. Tow it and you'll delay an emergency response." I thought surely that would be enough. I was wrong. She gave a dramatic sigh and said, "Well, maybe next time park legally. You public servants think you're above rules." And just like that, the tow truck arrived. The driver was a kid I vaguely recognized from community event. He hesitated when he saw me and mouthed, "I'm sorry," as Karen stormed up to his door. "If you don't tow it, I'll have your license suspended. I know people." That bluff was clearly part of her regular script. She looked like she enjoyed every second of it, like making people squirm was her cardio. I tried once more, this time louder. "My tools are in the back. I need that vehicle." But Karen refused to move as the hydraulic arm lifted my SUV off the ground. I radioed Blake immediately and told him the breaching tools wouldn't make it. He cursed so loudly I could hear it through his mic. "We're going to have to do this the hard way," he growled. Every second we wasted was another second a child might stop breathing. I sprinted back to the scene on foot, arriving just in time to see the team force entry with hand tools and sheer will. The boy was eventually pulled out, breathing but barely. Oxygen mask, neck brace, rushed to the hospital. He would live, but only by the skin of his teeth. Meanwhile, back at the tow yard, my SUV sat in impound, locked, with emergency gear inside. I wasn't allowed to retrieve it until a supervisor authorized the release. Funny thing, I was the supervisor. It didn't matter. The paperwork, they said, needed HOA Karen's sign-off because she initiated the private tow. I stared at the chain-link gate and breathed hard through my nose, jaw clenched. This wasn't over. By the time I got back home, my phone was already buzzing. Blake had said something to a reporter at the scene. A mic had been live. A tweet went out. Within the hour, the story exploded. Fire captain's emergency tools towed mid-rescue by HOA, with a picture of Karen pointing smugly at my SUV. Social media did what it does best. It exploded. Hashtags flew. Memes followed. I was both furious and amused to see a GIF of Karen photoshopped into a firefighter calendar, holding a flaming clipboard. But what struck me hardest was the video of the boy's mother, crying outside the hospital. They said they couldn't get to him right away because their equipment was towed? Who does that? Who thinks a parking rule matters more than my baby's life? It gutted me. Because I knew the answer. Karen did. And just like that, I realized the rescue wasn't over. Not for me. Karen had lit a fire she couldn't extinguish. And this time, I wasn't just the firefighter, I was the one bringing the heat. The morning after the rescue, I woke to the sound of multiple notifications pinging on my phone like rapid gunfire. Emails, voicemails, and text messages from fellow firefighters, city council aides, and even people I hadn't spoken to in years. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing yesterday's soot-streaked pants, rubbing the back of my neck as I tried to process the overnight chaos. What had started as a simple neighborhood emergency had erupted into a full-scale scandal. And at the center of it all was Karen, the HOA's self-appointed enforcer, now unknowingly famous across the internet for towing an on-duty fire captain's emergency vehicle during a live child rescue. Her smug face was frozen mid-gesture in dozens of viral memes. In one, she was edited into a burning building holding a parking citation. Another had her dressed as a Game of Thrones villain, commanding a fleet of tow trucks toward first responders. The internet had declared war, and Karen was its newest villain. But this wasn't just about laughs. The delay she caused wasn't a joke to those of us on the scene, and certainly not to the parents of the boy we almost lost. His name was Jeremy. 8 years old, just built his first treehouse with his grandpa. Now he was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from oxygen deprivation and a broken leg. The doctors were optimistic, but every second had counted. And the seconds Karen stole from us could never be refunded. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. There was a difference, and as a fire captain, I knew better than anyone how to walk that line. So I started with the truth. I wrote an internal report to my chief, detailing everything from the call I received to the confrontation with Karen to the towing company's role. I attached photos, timestamps, even audio logs. By noon, it was passed on to the city attorney's office. They responded fast. Faster than I expected. Because it turned out I wasn't the only city employee she'd interfered with. Later that day, I met with Detective Marissa Lang, who specialized in municipal obstruction cases. She didn't bother hiding her irritation. Apparently, Karen had developed quite the reputation at City Hall for harassing sanitation workers, reporting building inspectors for imaginary violations, and even once threatening a city permit clerk for not expediting her backyard koi pond application. Karen wasn't just a pain. She was a pattern. And now, thanks to her viral stunt, city officials were lining up to finally do something about her. Marissa smiled as she scrolled through Karen's infamous video, the one where she smugly explained her actions on camera. "I know he said he was a firefighter," Karen had said, "but anyone can slap a magnetic placard on their SUV. I follow rules. If someone breaks them, I enforce them." The internet had roasted her for that. Comment sections were flooded with things like, "Can someone tow her sense of humanity?" and this woman would cite an ambulance for double parking during CPR. But to us, it wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. Marissa leaned forward and said, "We're launching a formal investigation. But you'll need to stay public. The more people see what she did, the harder it'll be for her to bury it." That wasn't hard. My phone hadn't stopped ringing. By the afternoon, I was being invited to give interviews on the local news, community radio, even national morning shows. I wasn't interested in media attention, but I was interested in one thing: making sure this never happened again. So I agreed to one live interview with Channel 6 News. We met on the sidewalk where it all happened. I stood next to the red tow zone sign and explained what Karen had done while pointing at the now empty lot where my SUV had been taken. The reporter asked, "Do you think she knew you were trying to save a child's life?" I said, "She didn't care." That's worse. What followed was a cascade. Parents from the neighborhood began calling the news station, voicing their outrage. Some had kids who played with Jeremy. Others were just horrified. One mom called Karen a menace with a clipboard. Another dad revealed that Karen once fined him $200 because his garden hose was visible from the sidewalk. And then came the real twist. An elderly man named Richard, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, came forward with documents. He used to be on the HOA board. He'd resigned years ago, citing discomfort with financial practices. He had kept copies, receipts, emails, audio recordings, including one where Karen referred to emergency workers as blue-collar excuses for bending the rules. That clip went public in less than 10 minutes. The fallout was immediate. The HOA board tried to distance themselves from Karen, claiming she acted independently. But neighbors weren't buying it. Protests started forming outside the clubhouse. Small at first, just a few signs reading things like "Firefighters over fines" and "Don't let Karen kill us," but it grew. Within a week, a petition to remove the entire HOA board had over 3,000 signatures, including from residents outside our own neighborhood who were just fed up with the unchecked power of similar associations. Meanwhile, Karen tried to weather the storm. She stopped giving interviews, shut down her social media. But it was too late. The damage had gone beyond digital. Someone had placed a comically oversized magnetic fire decal on her own car. It said, "Karen's Emergency Ego Unit." I didn't do it, but I laughed when I saw it. Still, I didn't engage directly. I had work to do. Real emergencies to respond to. One of my team members joked, "You've gone viral, Cap. You're the meme hero we didn't know we needed." I appreciated the support, but the boy's face still haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had cut it too close, that if Jeremy had been buried under one more beam, it might have been a different ending. That night, I visited the hospital. Jeremy was awake, his eyes glassy but bright. His parents hugged me and thanked me over and over again. I felt undeserving. I had shown up. I had tried. But it was my SUV Karen had targeted, my equipment that never made it. Jeremy didn't care. He looked at me and whispered, "Are you the real fire captain?" I smiled and nodded. He grinned and said, "Cool." That was it. Just cool. And somehow that hit me harder than any speech. As I left his room, I made myself a promise. If Karen thought she could disrupt a rescue and walk away untouched, she had seriously underestimated who she was dealing with. The flames she'd ignited weren't going out. Not until justice was served. And I wasn't backing down. The silence outside Karen's house was deceptive, like the stillness before a wildfire. But underneath that silence, everything was unraveling. The HOA office was under audit. Karen's towing partner was dodging reporters. And the city's Public Safety Oversight Committee had just received a package from me that included timestamps, witness statements, radio transcripts, and an audio file of Karen claiming she didn't care what anyone said. Parking rules were more important than red lights. I'd sent it not as a firefighter, not even as a fire captain, but as a citizen who believed that abusing power should come with consequences. I didn't want fame, I wanted accountability. But what I got instead was a front-row seat to Karen's entire empire starting to collapse. City Hall was faster than I expected. Within 72 hours of my report, they issued a citation to the HOA for obstructing emergency response operations and referred the matter to the city attorney. But the part that made my coffee taste a little better that morning was when I learned they were also freezing all towing authorizations initiated by the HOA until the investigation was over. That meant Karen's signature wasn't worth anything anymore. She might still wave her clipboard around like it held divine authority, but no tow truck in the county was coming when she called. That, apparently, did not sit well with her. The same day the citation went public, she marched right down to the HOA office in a rage, screaming that she was being targeted for doing her job. But no one was listening. The office manager, who I'd spoken to privately the day before, quietly began boxing up files, printing out receipts, and emailing the city council directly with what she called long overdue grievances. Karen still didn't get it. She thought this was a PR problem, that if she just kept her head down, the storm would pass. But this wasn't about a bad headline or a few angry neighbors. This was about a line she crossed and couldn't uncross. I wasn't just some resident she could intimidate. I was a fire captain with every rescue log, every timestamp, and a team of first responders ready to testify that her obsession with power nearly cost a child his life. And while she buried her head, the rest of the city was watching. The biggest shift came when a city councilwoman named Diana Herrera took an interest in the case. She wasn't just a council member. She was a former EMT. She knew exactly what was at stake. Diana called me personally. Her tone was sharp, no nonsense, the way people sound when they've seen too much to be surprised. She told me she was preparing legislation to limit HOA authority when it came to public safety and emergency services, and she wanted me to speak at the upcoming session. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't a politician. I hated microphones. But then I thought of Jeremy, of the look on his mother's face, of Karen's smug expression as my SUV was dragged away mid-rescue. And I said yes. I didn't prepare a fancy speech. I just told the truth. The day of the session, I stood at the podium in full uniform, surrounded by fellow firefighters, paramedics, and even a few police officers who had stories of their own about HOA interference. I spoke plainly. I explained how one person's obsession with control nearly derailed a rescue. I reminded them that we wear these uniforms to serve, not to be punished for doing our jobs. I ended by saying, we don't get to pause emergencies. And we sure as hell shouldn't have to ask permission to save lives. The room was silent when I stepped down. But then, slowly, people began to stand. Applause broke out. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was heavy. The kind of applause you feel in your spine. Karen wasn't at the hearing. But her name was everywhere. News outlets picked up the story again, this time focusing on the potential for real policy change. One reporter called it the Karen Clause. Another ran a headline that read, "From Clipboard to Courtroom, the Fall of an HOA Queen." Meanwhile, the HOA board was holding emergency meetings behind closed doors. Several members resigned quietly. Others issued public statements distancing themselves from Karen's actions. One even claimed she was unaware that Karen had access to private towing authority, even though emails later revealed she'd approved those contracts herself. What really set things ablaze, though, was what happened next. An anonymous whistleblower leaked internal HOA emails that showed Karen had a pattern of targeting residents she personally disliked. She had lists. She tracked which homes left garbage cans out 5 minutes too long, which children rode bikes on the sidewalk, which families threw unapproved gatherings. She even had notes on which residents had been seen talking to me since the rescue. Her entire operation looked less like neighborhood enforcement and more like a petty dictatorship. The community's response was swift. Lawn signs popped up overnight that read, firefighters welcome. Karen, not so much. People held a block party in Jeremy's honor and invited every local station to cover it. Karen stayed in her house, blinds drawn, but that didn't stop a group of kids from building a cardboard fire truck and driving it past her window with sirens blaring from a Bluetooth speaker. It was funny, sure, but it also meant something. The neighborhood was taking its power back. While the city investigation expanded, the legal wheels began turning. The family of the rescued boy filed a civil claim against the HOA, citing obstruction and emotional distress. Their attorney was sharp and ruthless. I didn't envy the defense team. Karen, now facing both public outrage and legal action, finally broke her silence. She scheduled a press conference outside her house. It was surreal. She stood behind a plastic podium flanked by 2 folding chairs and tried to play the victim. She claimed she was being harassed, bullied, and misunderstood. That she never intended to delay a rescue. That she just wanted to keep the neighborhood safe. But when a reporter asked her, "Would you tow a firefighter again if they parked outside your office?" she paused just a little too long. Then she said, "If they broke the rules, yes." That was the moment she buried herself for good. The clip went viral instantly. It was shared side by side with the image of my towed SUV and the video of Jeremy being lifted onto a stretcher. The court of public opinion had already made up its mind. And now, so had the real court. The city attorney announced they would file formal charges for interfering with emergency operations and violating city safety ordinances. Not only that, but they were also considering pursuing criminal negligence. Karen was stunned. She had spent years believing she was untouchable. Now she was discovering just how wrong she was. And still, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, determined. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about making sure this never happened again. And while Karen scrambled to keep her crumbling tower of control upright, I was already thinking about what came next. Because while she had tried to make the story about power and rules, we were going to end it with something stronger. With truth. With service. And with a neighborhood that finally remembered what community really meant. It was only a matter of time before everything Karen had built began to crack. But when the cracks widened into chasms, no one expected just how far the fallout would go. The city's legal machinery had finally shifted into full gear, and it wasn't moving slowly. Between the public outrage, the media storm, and the growing mountain of evidence, Karen was no longer seen as just an overzealous HOA officer. She was now the poster child for what happens when unchecked authority collides with public safety. But even then, Karen still tried to hang on. She clung to her routines like they were lifelines, strutting to the mailbox with her head held high, parading around the neighborhood with her clipboard as if none of it were real. But the glares, the whispers, and the signs in people's yards made it clear that the illusion had shattered. She had become the villain of her own story, and there was no rewriting that narrative. The first official hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse, and I was subpoenaed as a witness. I had never set foot in that building in uniform outside of emergency drills or fire inspections, but this was different. I wasn't there to assess a smoke alarm or a faulty breaker. I was there to speak the truth under oath. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the kind that feels like the pressure before a fire backdraft. Karen entered the room dressed in muted tones, her usual arrogance replaced by a hollow stare. It was the first time I'd seen her without the clipboard, and it was almost unsettling. She looked smaller, not physically, but as if the weight of consequences had finally begun to collapse in around her. Her attorney, visibly flustered, tried to paint her as a misunderstood civic-minded resident who simply overstepped her role in a moment of confusion. But no one bought it. Not after the media footage. Not after the audio clips. Not after seeing Jeremy's mother sitting just a few rows behind me, clutching her son's hospital bracelet like it was a sacred relic. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I spoke clearly, describing the sequence of events leading up to the tow, the denial of access to emergency equipment, and the near-fatal delay it caused. I explained the basic protocols for fire rescue and how essential every second is during entrapment rescues. I emphasized that my vehicle was clearly marked, my lights were activated, and that Karen was explicitly told it was an active emergency. I ended by repeating the same line I had said on the news, only this time under oath. We do not get to pause emergencies, and no one should have the power to stop a rescue in progress because they're obsessed with rules on a spreadsheet. The room was silent. The judge scribbled notes. Karen didn't look up once. When the city attorney cross-examined her, it didn't take long for her story to crumble. At first, she claimed she didn't know I was a fire captain. Then, when shown the photos of my SUV's emergency placards, she changed her tone, saying she wasn't sure they were real. That was when the courtroom collectively shifted. A quiet murmur rippled through the seats, a mix of disbelief and restrained anger. When the city attorney asked her if she had considered calling dispatch to verify, she shrugged. That shrug, captured by cameras and broadcast across every local news outlet, became the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't just negligence. It was willful disregard. The judge's decision wasn't just swift, it was scathing. In a statement that would later be quoted by newspapers across the state, he said, Karen's behavior represents a dangerous precedent. She weaponized authority in the face of an emergency, and in doing so, endangered public safety. This court finds her liable for obstruction of emergency services and gross negligence. He ordered immediate financial restitution to the family and an injunction that permanently barred Karen from serving on any homeowners association board within city limit. But the damage went even further. The HOA itself was now under formal review for systemic misconduct. Their towing contracts were suspended. Their internal policies were revoked. The board was forced to dissolve pending re-election and oversight. Every resident in the neighborhood was notified via certified letter that the structure of their community governance would be rewritten from the ground up. It would have been easy to feel vindicated, to celebrate, but all I felt was a strange sort of quiet. Like the end of a long shift where the fire's been put out, but the air still smells like smoke and ash. There were no heroes here, not really. Just a boy who almost didn't make it, a mother who would never forget those minutes of uncertainty, and a city that had learned something the hard way. The next week, the fire department held a community forum. Not about the case, but about public safety protocols, emergency cooperation, and what residents could do to assist rather than hinder first responders. I stood on stage alongside paramedics, EMTs, and police officers. We answered questions. We listened. People thanked us. Some apologized for not realizing how easily things could go wrong. And then something unexpected happened. A man in the crowd, an elderly resident named Mr. Lawson, stepped forward with a suggestion. He proposed dedicating the space outside the HOA clubhouse, the same lot where my SUV had been towed from, as an official emergency staging area. It was simple, symbolic, and powerful. The city agreed. Within 2 weeks, construction began on installing a designated emergency supply station. Bright red signs marked the spot, and a plaque was ordered for the base of the new fire cache. It read, "In honor of every second that matters." I was there the day they unveiled it. So was Jeremy, now walking with a slight limp but grinning from ear to ear. His mom gave me a hug that lasted longer than words could carry. As the neighborhood gathered for the ribbon cutting, something shifted. People who had once been afraid of Karen's petty fines and late-night rule enforcement were laughing, smiling, reclaiming their community. The tension that had choked our streets was gone. In its place was something lighter, freer. Karen? She didn't show. But she was still in the headlines. A new article had just dropped about how she was now being investigated for fraud related to HOA budget mismanagement. Apparently, those koi pond permits were just the tip of the iceberg. I didn't care much about what happened next for her. Whatever justice decided, I trusted it would be enough. What mattered to me was that no future responder would ever face what I did. That no child's life would hang in the balance because someone with a clipboard thought parking lines were more important than oxygen and survival. The neighborhood moved on, slowly but surely. People planted flowers again. Kids rode bikes without being chased off. The fire station received dozens of handwritten thank you cards. One, from a 6-year-old, simply said, "Thank you for fighting the fire lady." I laughed when I read it. It was the kind of moment that reminded me why we wear the badge. Not for power, not for praise, but because when things go wrong, someone has to show up and make them right. And no tow truck in the world can stop that. The weeks that followed brought a strange peace to the neighborhood, a kind of collective exhale after months of invisible tension and one very visible explosion. It wasn't just that Karen was gone from her self-appointed throne, or that the HOA board had been dismantled and rebuilt under city supervision, or even that the absurd towing rules had been permanently rescinded. It was that people finally started looking at each other like neighbors again, instead of potential citation targets. The difference was subtle at first. A nod between two residents who'd once refused to speak because of a disagreement over hedge height, a quiet chuckle as someone walked their dog past the old HOA office, which now stood empty with the blinds drawn tight. The air felt different, more breathable, like the place had remembered how to be a community again. Karen's presence didn't just disappear though. It lingered like the last bitter whiff of smoke long after the fire's been put out. Word spread quickly that she had moved out of the neighborhood entirely. No farewell notes, no dramatic final statement. Just a moving truck in the middle of the night and a foreclosure notice on her mailbox 2 weeks later. Whether she sold the house in a panic or lost it to mounting legal fees, no one really knew. No one really cared either. Some people hoped she had learned something. Others just hoped she'd never return. But the ripple effect of what she'd done was far from over. The city passed what they eventually called the Emergency Response Protection Act, legislation that required all HOAs within city limits to undergo mandatory public safety training and compliance reviews. It banned private towing companies from operating without clear coordination with city services during an emergency and made it illegal to obstruct or delay any on-duty responder, whether uniformed or plainclothed, without facing misdemeanor charges and immediate suspension of HOA authority. It was a win. A rare, meaningful, lasting win. But victories like that don't come with confetti or parade. They come with meetings and signatures, and sometimes just a few words scribbled on an ordinance in ink. Still, when I saw my name listed in the legislative summary under community contributors, something hit me. Not pride exactly, but a quiet satisfaction. I had never asked for this fight. I hadn't wanted the attention, or the headlines, or the chaos. All I'd wanted that day was to save a child's life. But now, because of it, other lives might be saved too, and this time without interference, without petty power trips, without someone waving a clipboard in the way of a rescue. There was one final moment I hadn't been prepared for. It came on a Saturday morning, 2 months after the courtroom decision and 3 weeks after the fire cache had been installed at the clubhouse lot. I was cleaning out the back of my SUV, organizing tools and checking expiration dates on rescue kits, when I heard footsteps approach behind me. I turned to see Jeremy and his mom. He was holding something behind his back and grinning like he had a secret he couldn't wait to share. His mother smiled but looked like she might cry at any second. Jeremy stepped forward and handed me a framed picture. It was a drawing, childlike and shaky but unmistakable. A red SUV with flashing lights, a kid in a treehouse smiling, and a stick figure in a firefighter hat holding what looked like a giant sandwich, which I assumed was meant to be the breaching tool. Above the picture, in uneven blue crayon letters, it read, "My hero has a truck." I laughed so hard I almost dropped it, and then I blinked too fast to stop my own eyes from watering. His mother said thank you again, though we'd already thanked each other a dozen times. But this time she said it differently. Not just as a parent to a firefighter, but as a neighbor to someone who stood up and refused to let wrong go unanswered. I didn't have a speech prepared. I just crouched down to Jeremy's level and said, "If you ever want a ride along when you're older, the passenger seat's yours." He beamed and nodded like I'd just promised him the moon. It was one of those tiny moments that make all the noise, all the battles, all the paperwork and politics worth it. The next fire station open house had the biggest turnout in years. Families came with cookies and thank you card. Local businesses donated snacks. The mayor gave a short speech and tried to make a joke about how we'd all learned not to mess with red SUVs anymore. It landed about as well as most political jokes do, but the crowd was forgiving. Everyone was there for something bigger: connection, gratitude, rebuilding. As I stood near the fire truck, watching kids climb the steps and parents laugh with their neighbors, I caught a glimpse of something across the street. A realtor hammering a "for sale" sign into the ground in front of what used to be Karen's house. It was poetic, really. The last remaining thread finally snipped. It wasn't long before a new family moved in. Young couple, 2 kids, dog named Daisy. No clipboard. No ridiculous fines. No drama. Just people trying to build something better. I introduced myself the day they moved in and helped carry in a bookshelf. They seemed surprised. I told them we do things differently around here now. The husband laughed and said they'd heard something about a fire truck situation, but figured it was just local gossip. I smiled and said, "Only half gossip. You'll see." Over time, the neighborhood rewrote itself. Not with rules or memos, but with kindness. Front porches saw more use. Yards were a little more relaxed. Kids stayed out 5 minutes later and no one complained. The clubhouse, once a symbol of control and micromanagement, turned into a community hub again. We held barbecues, game nights, even CPR training sessions for interested residents. The same place where Karen had ordered my SUV to be towed now had a mural on the side, painted by local artists and high school volunteers. It featured a fire engine, a child's hand reaching up, and the words, "Community means showing up, not shutting down." I didn't need credit for any of it. I already had my reward. It was in every peaceful day that passed without someone being harassed. In every neighborly wave I got from a porch swing. In every new dad who asked what to do if they saw smoke. I kept working, kept responding to calls, kept training new recruits. But I also kept an eye on our neighborhood from a different angle now. Not just as a first responder, but as someone who had seen what silence and fear could do, and how one act of interference could almost cost a life. Some people say stories like this are rare, that they burn hot and disappear quickly. Maybe that's true, but I've learned that when a fire gets put out the right way, it doesn't just disappear, it makes space for something else to grow. Stronger foundations, deeper roots, a community that's no longer afraid to speak up. Karen thought she could wield fear like a weapon, but in the end, all she did was make us realize how powerful unity could be. We didn't just survive her. We built something better because of her. And now that's the story we tell. One fire, one clipboard, one SUV, and a neighborhood that learned to fight for each other, not against.